Hello and welcome to Lecture 1 of Week 2, Film Production The Basics for English 2450, Com 2010, Intro to Film. This is a friendly reminder that the content of these videos can and will be used in your quizzes, final exam, class discussion, and group activities, so please make sure to watch these lectures in their entirety before class on Wednesday. This week we're covering film production, and the videos will be split into 3. Video number 1, this one, is covering the basics of film production. Video 2 will be breaking down the 4 phases of film production, and video 3 will be looking at distribution and exhibition of films. So a brief outline of what I'll be covering in this specific video. I'm going to start by talking about how we think of films, kind of broadly construed, thinking about alternatives to Hollywood production, the intentionality of film production and how it's changed over time, and then I'm going to wrap up by giving some historical context on why film production looks the way it does today. So without further ado, let's take a look at our first slide. One important thing to think about when we're discussing film is what we view the purpose of film to be. So typically when I ask students that question, like, why do we watch films? The answer is usually to be entertained. We watch films because we enjoy them. And of course that's true. They are entertainment and they're part of a very large entertainment business. However, films are also artistic and technological products as well. So one thing I want us to think about throughout this semester is how films are 3 things at the same time. They are art, they are technology, and they are business. And those 3 components always work together, occasionally against each other, but the point is that they're constantly influencing each other. So if we ignore any one of those 3 pieces, the artistry, the technology, or the business of filmmaking, we lose an important piece of context that helps us understand how films work and why we should care about them. If we ignore the artistic and cultural components of film, we're discounting the real work and the real creativity and skill that goes into the process of making films. If we ignore the technology, we miss an important piece of historical context, as the technology of filmmaking has massively changed since the late 19th century when film first became a thing. And if we ignore the fact that films are also a business, that it is designed to make money, then we also lose some historical context about how that business has changed, how industrial practices have changed, the rise of the blockbuster film in the 1980s, the rise of the megaplex in the 1970s and 80s as well, and we lose kind of a very important piece of the overall puzzle. So it's really important to remember that films aren't just art, and they're not just entertainment, and they're not just technology, but they're all 3 of those things at the same time. Another thing to keep in mind is that the Hollywood production mode is not the only game in town. This is not the only way to make a film. There are several alternatives to the Hollywood production mode, which I've listed here. There are small-scale films, which are produced by a single person or maybe a small group of people without a distributor in place. These are films that might end up on a film festival circuit or might end up uploaded to YouTube that are maybe created through like an Indiegogo campaign or something like that. And some of these films never see a major theatrical release. Some of them do, but several years after they're initially filmed. The important thing to keep in mind here is that not all films are produced with a massive budget and a huge crew. Films can be made, especially given the changes in technology and accessibility of filmmaking technology, by very small groups or small numbers of people. Documentary filmmaking typically follows a production process similar to narrative filmmaking, but there isn't a script writing phase. Typically, a documentary starts with a question or a concept rather than a script, like a narrative film. Animated filmmaking also has some differences from the typical live-action production process, which is what we'll be focusing on this week. But that distinction is getting a little bit fuzzier the more films use CGI. At this point, live-action films use enough CGI where some film scholars would even call them animated or at least partially animated films. So the distinctions between production of animation and productions of live action films are getting a little bit more complicated the more we use CGI in everyday kind of standard films, not just the big budget science fiction and superhero spectacle films where we're used to seeing CGI. The next piece of the puzzle is to remember that filmmaking is a series of decisions and that those decisions are intentional and they are highly scrutinized. If you've ever sat through the end credits of any major Hollywood film, you'll realize that their incredibly large cast and crew shows how much work and effort goes into the average film. And all of the decisions that are made by all of those people are scrutinized because films are expensive to make, which of course means that those decisions are not being made randomly and they're not being made without input of the producers and the people who are financing the filmmaking process. So it's important to remember that filmmaking is a series of artistic decisions and that the cast and crews of these films are artists. They are skilled, they are trained. But a lot of times the decisions they're made are constrained by business concerns and constrained by what the technology is able to do. So the more that film technology advances, the more accessible and small cameras become, the more decisions and options become available to filmmakers. We can do a lot more technologically with film than someone could have done in 1910, obviously, which means that the filmmaking process just gets more and more complicated every year. It's important to keep that context in mind so we can appreciate how much effort and decision-making goes into creating a film. It's pretty common for students to say things like, well, I don't know if I'm reading too much into this, or do we really care if the pen is blue? Maybe the blue pen is just random. But it's important to remember that we analyze those details because they are there on purpose. That doesn't mean every single detail has some deep symbolic meaning, but it does mean that if there's a blue pen, someone actively decided on a blue pen. They didn't just pick something out of their pocket and throw it on the set. So just keep in mind that decisions in filmmaking are intentional, they're scrutinized, and they're not random. Now, the last piece of this that I wanted to talk about for the basics is that there are three kind of broadly speaking stages or phases of large-scale Hollywood film production. The film is produced, it's distributed, and it's exhibited. Production, distribution, exhibition. It's made, it's distributed, and it's shown. Now, the reason why we're talking about these things as if they're separate processes in separate videos is because the Paramount decision has necessitated that Hollywood studios treat those three phases of the process as separate phases. So this thing, the Paramount decision, was a court case determined in 1948, which determined that a single entity cannot produce, distribute, and exhibit its own films. This is because producing, distributing, and exhibiting your own films, like major Hollywood studios used to do prior to 1948, is a form of vertical integration that actually violates antitrust and anti-monopoly laws. Essentially, prior to 1948, movie studios could make movies, distribute movies, and exhibit them in their own theaters. That meant they had a lot of power. They could prevent other movie studios from showing films in their theaters. They could set the prices. They could lock actors and directors into long-term contracts. And that was way too much power for any kind of one entity to hold. So the Paramount decision undid this. And after the decision, major movie studios were told, hey, you have to sell off at least one part of this process. You can produce and distribute, you can produce and exhibit, you can distribute and exhibit. You can't do all three. You have to get rid of one of these pieces here. So movie studios decided to sell off their theater chains. And this was kind of the beginning of the end of the studio system. This kind of undid a lot of the power that they had, and we started moving towards a different style of Hollywood film production. The studio system had actors and directors locked into long-term contracts. The independent system allowed a lot more flexibility and freedom. Directors could move from studio to studio. They could shop around their ideas more. Actors weren't locked into 10 or 20 or 30-year contracts anymore. So it's made things a bit more flexible and open-ended. And this started kind of coming into fruition in like the 1960s and 1970s. So this has pretty massively changed how films are produced, distributed, and exhibited in the United States. It's an important piece of historical context to keep in mind, and it's worth researching further if you're interested in the history of movies. So leading into the next video, I'm going to be talking about the production process for large-scale Hollywood films following the Paramount decision in 1948. So looking at the more kind of current version of how Hollywood movies are made, which is broken down into 4 phases, which is script writing and funding, pre-production, production, and post-production. So stay tuned for the next video.